Madam President, with what we went through in the state of Florida in the attempts of suppressing voters, you would think with the experience of people having stood in line in order to vote for 5 to 7 hours, that it would have put this issue to rest. But they're back at it again. And this time in a very subtle way. The governor's office, through his appointed Secretary of State, who is the chief elections officer, has now interpreted a statute that in a municipal election, that students at the University of Florida cannot early vote prior to the election on campus at their student center. The interpretation is made that it's an educational facility and does not qualify according to the statute on a technical reason that it is not a government-owned conference facility, when indeed it's owned by the state of Florida through the university. And indeed, it is a conference facility for many, many conferences, outside groups as well as student groups. No, what it is an attempt in a run-up to the November election to try to make it more difficult, less convenient for students to vote. As it turns out, in this particular municipal election coming up shortly, students would have to go across town some 1.5 miles in another location, some 3 miles away. And of course, students, as busy as they are, that's going to discourage them. And so if they end up doing this for this special election in March, a municipal election, they are of course going to try to do it for the November election when we have a statewide election for the governor and the cabinet. Why? Well, an attempt to suppress students' votes who may not be voting for the people in power that are trying to suppress their votes. It's all the more of interest because there will be on the ballot a proposed constitutional amendment to change the state constitution to allow, by doctor's prescription, medical marijuana, something that has generated interest in all sectors of society, but particular among students. Another reason they want to come out to vote. The whole idea of early voting is to try to make it more convenient for people to be able to vote that they might not find it because of a babysitter problem, a work problem on election day. But early voting, as we saw in the experience of the 2012 election, the days were shortened from 14 to 8. They cut out the Sunday before the Tuesday election, a day that Professor Dan Smith, doing a study at the University of Florida, found that those that availed themselves for Sunday voting were primarily Hispanics and African Americans. And indeed, the attempts were made in limiting the number of early voting locations within a county, and then of those early vote locations having a facility that was small so that you could not get a lot of voting machines in. Again, another way, very subtle, of trying to suppress the vote. So the people of Florida naturally were outraged, particularly when they heard stories of the 101-year-old lady that had to stay 3.5 hours in order to cast her vote, and the others that were staying 5 and 7 hours, and they were not going to have their vote taken away from them. And they stood in line. And so the people were outraged. And so there was an attempt to pass a new law. And I will close this, Madam President. This new law now is being interpreted that the very same suppression efforts are occurring again. And we are simply not going to let this happen if we have to call the Justice Department in. Madam President, I yield the floor.